Hey everyone, thanks for joining today's show. Today I want to go over two important questions that I think we need to ask right now. The first one is, should we be using child activists as political spokespeople? You see it a lot nowadays. You see people like David Hogg on gun reform or Greta Thunberg on climate change. You see them being used as headliners for political agendas and subjects, and they're thrust into the news and TV and get different articles about how they're big important people in these activist movements. And I want to see and look at if that's a good idea or a bad idea. Not necessarily whether or not their ideas are right or wrong. You can decide that. But as to whether or not we should be having them in these positions of influence is a good thing. The second question I want to talk about is kind of related, and it's, should we lower the voting age? Been hearing it a lot recently from a lot of the Democratic candidates for president. They want to lower the voting age to 16, get more people voting. They want more viewpoints in there. And it's the same idea that these young people and these children, their ideas are better and superior, and we need their votes in there, or at least they're just as valid, and they want their votes in there, and they want them as political spokespeople and whatnot. So we're going to take a look at both of these and see whether or not both of these things are good ideas. So, as I mentioned before, a few examples. I want to go into 4 specific stories that will illustrate a few different points and help us kind of get an idea of the different situations surrounding different teen activists and child activists. So let's start with David Hogg, for instance. And yeah, that kid's a piece of work. You've seen his Twitter and all the stuff he still puts out. It's a lot. But aside from all the crap and ridiculousness that he puts out, let's just take a look at the story behind it. So, 17-year-old high school student, regular family, goes to a high school, average American teenager. But one day, there's a shooter at his school, right? Former student comes in, starts shooting up staff, students. A lot of them successfully are able to hide until he's subdued, but many students lost their lives or some were critically injured, and that traumatized a lot of students there and, really impacted them in different ways, and some people react in different ways, and David's was to become an activist. Now, as to attest to the motivation behind it, I don't know. What pushed him all the way to do that, I can't fully say. Based on some of the things he says, it makes you wonder. But for the sake of argument, let's just say that the reason he became an activist for stopping gun violence was because he really hated gun violence. So that's his story. He becomes an activist in the fight against guns. And we'll get into the specifics of that in a little bit. But before we do, let's move on to the next story. Now, our next story is about who I mentioned before, Greta Thunberg. Now, she's just a young girl who hears about climate change, right? And she hears that we're all going to be dead in a few years. Whatever the number is now, it changes all the time. So she becomes a climate activist. Now, with anything that you're passionate about and changing, you should start with yourself. So she does. She starts with herself, gets her parents in on it, and then gets more people she knows in on it until she's an activist and trying to get the world in on it, right? And then she's thrust on the cover of magazines, she's put on the news, she gives speeches, all kinds of stuff. She is thrust in the limelight, a lot of fame, big activist on the subject. Our third story is a little bit older. You might not have heard of this boy. His name was Iqbal. He was sold into slavery at the age of 4 by his family, and it was to pay off a debt, as they owed some money. And in this position, he would work in a carpet factory for essentially no pay, given not very much food, or conditions to work in. Terrible thing to do to a child. It's terrible conditions to be in. And he finally escapes. So when he does, he's lived in that experience of, slavery, and he knows millions of other children are actually suffering from what he did. So he decides to fight back against it and becomes a spokesperson, speaks out against it. And I think we can all agree that child slavery is not a good thing and would be on board with people speaking against it. But by the age of 10, he's killed for speaking out on these beliefs. So our last story is about just some students at a school who basically felt that the rules were a little too oppressive, and they didn't like the different ways the school would treat them. They thought there were too many rules, things weren't fair, and wanted to change. So they fight against the school and actually somehow win and get the school to implement this new program where they basically can leave a few hours early. They can show up if they want to class. They don't have to. They can basically request the grades that they want. They get them. It's easy living for a high school student, and it sounds great if you're a high school student, right? You go in, you don't have to do anything. You just hang out with your friends, do what you want. Well, fast forward 20, 30 years down the road, these students are all adults, and they kind of have some regrets. And while life still worked out for a few of them, others were hindered in their career paths and their futures by that choice they made when they were younger. They missed out on so much education and learning, and it really hindered them later on in life. So now we come back to our question, the first one. Should child activists be used as political spokespeople? Now, it's not necessarily bad for a child or a teen to be an activist and be passionate about a cause, right? It's good to get them involved in things that matter. But the issue, I think it's a big issue when it comes to using them as the headliners or the spokespeople for the cause, that in their face is the representation for the cause. And I want to clear something up. Young people, just because they're young does not mean their opinions are invalid or they don't know what they're talking about. There's a lot of young people who do educate themselves and are very smart, and everyone's entitled to have their opinion, and we should hear different people's viewpoints, right? But I take issue with their opinions and their views being elevated on this pedestal where it's like they're more important and they hold more weight than everyone else's opinions. And you do see that. Why would they be using children in this way? Somehow they think it makes it look like they're more educated on the subject because these kids are behind them and they're involved. Now, that doesn't quite track because children have less experience and less knowledge about the world, They haven't lived as much as adults who are saying the same things. Often in school, a lot of teens and children are taught what to think, not how to think. Now, that's a big problem because when you're taught that way, you don't gather all the facts and then make educated, critical decisions and get behind a cause based on those. When you're taught what to think, what happens is you're given some of the facts, some of the information in a skewed fashion, and then you're given the opinion that you're supposed to hold without question. And if it is question, it's not real questions. It's questions to make that point look like it's right. And this is how a lot of people are taught now, most people. So instead of teaching critical thinking, they're taught, here, this is what you need to know, this is the facts, this is true, accept it, and promote it. So then you have these children or teens that have a bunch of information they're told is right and can't be argued with, so they're going to argue back against the people that disagree with them because they're taught there's no way that their opinion is wrong and their belief is wrong. And then they become angry and fight back against them. So back to the question of should they be political spokespeople, there doesn't seem to be a good reason to use them in that way. That's our first point. There's not really a good reason to have them in those positions because in the end, they're echoing points that all these other adults and grown-ups are making, right? They hear it from all these sources and then they just repeat it. But it's coming from the face and body of a child, so they're going to use it, right? Why not just use the people that are more educated on the subject and so-called experts on your side, right? Why do we need to throw children in the mix? But that's not necessarily an argument for not using them. That's kind of just a point of there's no really benefit to it other than for some reason, it makes your cause seem more righteous. But I think there's actually a bad reason or a bad result of doing this. There's negatives that come from it. So let's get on to the dangers and the reasons not to do it, because like I said, we've established that there's not really a good reason to do it. Now I want to talk about why it's actually a bad idea. Look at the story of Iqbal. Now this is going to be the most extreme example, but like I said, I don't think any of us would disagree that his cause was noble. Getting children out of slavery is a great thing. But that child's life ended at the age of 10. It stopped. He was killed for speaking out against a certain subject. And while that might not be the case in the situation of every child activist in every country, it does put an unnecessary target on their backs. They're a kid, they're a young person. Let them be just that. We're supposed to protect them and keep them safe. And putting them out into this, public view, there are crazy people out there that are going to hear what they say, whatever side of the argument they're on. They'll be extreme left, extreme right, whatever they are, the violent groups on whatever side. They're going to hear these opinions from these kids and get angry, and it's going to build up inside them, and there's potential they could do physical harm. But if not physical harm, they're going to still endure psychological and emotional abuse from people. We have the internet now, and that is the one go-to place for people to express their hate. These kids are going to see that, and it's probably going to take a toll. While some might be able to handle it, it seems like since there's no honest benefit of putting them in these positions, why on earth would we even risk exposing them to that kind of harm and those attacks? There's no need, and it's absolutely ridiculous that we're elevating them into these positions. So moving on from that, I want to go on to a related question that I mentioned earlier. Should we lower the voting age? I've been seeing a lot lately that a lot of Democratic candidates are kind of pushing for this idea of lowering the voting age to 16. It's currently at 18. They want to lower it by 2 years. Why do they want to do that? Well, I'll get to why in a second, but first I want to explain why I don't think this is a good idea either. And it has a similar concept, as not using children as political activists or spokespeople. It's that in voting, the whole point of voting is for the people in a country to educate themselves on how the country works and issues that are currently going on. And the point of that is to then vote for candidates who are going to fix the problems and know how to best run the country, right? So why are we going to give that responsibility to 16-year-olds? That is a big responsibility. It's huge. Voting is a big responsibility. And 16-year-olds don't have a whole lot of responsibilities as a whole. Now, I know someone out there is going to say, well, I know Timmy, and he's 16, and he knows more about politics and economics and the way the country runs than I do. Okay, yes, that is your example of someone you know. But here's the thing. We don't give out the ability to vote on an individual basis. People don't walk into an office that, says, well, you seem like you know what you're talking about. You can vote. You can't vote. You don't know what you're talking about. We use age as a benchmark. And if we're going to continue to use age, we need to go off your average everyday 16-year-old who now when we look at it, does not have enough experience and does not have the knowledge and know-how. And I come back to the point I said earlier of children being taught what to think, not how to think. So when you have that happening with young people all over the country, you're not going to have people who are actually educated on the subject that can make well-informed decisions that will be for the betterment of the country. They're going to vote off just the limited knowledge that they're taught and they hear from media, politicians, celebrities, the news, their teachers, which all are going to be heavily skewed one way, as we know. As a result, by lowering the voting age, you would probably end up with a lot more votes for things such as socialism and programs like Medicare for All, because they make it sound good to these kids, right? So a kid, hears that Medicare for All is what we need. We need everyone to have health care. And that sounds like a great idea, right? as a person, I don't want anyone else to suffer. I think everyone should be given medical treatment, surgeries, whatever they need, right? Everyone should be able to live long, happy lives. And that's what they hear, and they go with it. But since that's what they're told and they just accept it, they don't actually put into any critical thinking into it. They obviously aren't thinking that, hey, healthcare takes money to pay for, right? Who's going to pay for it if it's just given to everybody? Well, even if they get as far as asking that question, they'll just get the answer, oh, the rich will pay for it. And they're satisfied. No more digging. It takes digging into a subject and actually looking into what people are saying and listening and analyzing to know if that something's going to work. And they don't realize that the numbers don't add up. Just taxing rich people isn't going to take care of everyone in the country's healthcare. In addition to that, they're all well and good because they aren't responsible for money yet. Of course, people are going to vote for that until they fall into that category of rich, which might be lower than a lot of people think. And then, aside from that, they don't think about what the implications of that are. Since only so much healthcare can be paid for, everyone, if it's supposedly free, right? Everyone's going to go take advantage of it. Let's say 50 people need a surgery. Well, there's only enough money here to pay for 25 of those surgeries. So now, instead of John over here, who's worked his whole life and, decided he wanted to spend money on healthcare insurance over, the latest iPhone technology or whatever for his house, he's put his money towards buying health insurance so he can take care of himself. Instead of having that option, he's now on the same level as Joe over here, who decided, who wouldn't have bought healthcare in the first place. But now it's free to both. They're both going to go to use it. But instead of having the choice and making people, make smart decisions, or having people make smart decisions and people working and being able to choose, it's going to be chosen for them. And that, to me, is way more evil than other people just not having healthcare because of not buying it and not buying health insurance. The government taking over healthcare and doing this isn't the way to go. But back to the point, we're going to get off on a tangent here and do a whole episode on healthcare. But back to the point, teenagers and children don't think about all those different things. They're not involved in that conversation. They have it in their head how it's told to them and how it's supposed to be. So even if you bring up an argument like that with them, they might not even think about it and just keep accepting what they're doing. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is that they need more life experience and responsibilities and stuff to understand the full implications of what socialism and things like Medicare for All would do, so they can be educated when they vote on it. And actually, I really think that the same argument I'm making there would actually lead to raising the voting age, because think about your average 18-year-old. Granted, sure, numbers-wise, there's more grown-up 18-year-olds than 16-year-olds, but as a whole, are most 18-year-olds nowadays considered grown-ups? Look at the average age for growing up is... people are going well into their 20s and 30s with still relying on mom and daddy for everything. So, all that to say, when using age as a benchmark for voting, we need to be careful with just giving it out willy-nilly to, oh, let's lower it again, let's give it to... And this applies to other areas too, not just age. They want to let people who aren't citizens of the country vote. Why does that make any sense? People who don't have stake in it and don't have the responsibilities that every other American does, and it's not going to affect them in the same way. So I then come to, why do a lot of these candidates want to lower the voting age? Why do they want to use young people as activists? Why do we see this heavily from left-leaning people? And when I say left-leaning, I mean like the socialists, far-left people that are now permeating the party. the reason we see it is because their ideas are bad, and to win and get votes, they need uneducated people. They need ignorance to win, so to speak. So they're trying as hard as they can, to get your average American voter, but any voter with, a little bit of common sense is going to realize that, hey, things are working out a lot better under capitalism and all the policies going on right now than they would if this guy Bernie or whoever was elected. They realize that, and they have a grasp. So, since these people can't get their votes, they've got to add votes in from somewhere, right? Their goal is to win, so they now have to resort to another tactic. That's get more votes. So that is why they push so hard for lowering the voting age. They want more kids in on it because it's easier to influence them. They want non-citizens to vote because they promise them things and make them think it's going to be better for them. They try to just expand it in many ways possible. And that's also why they're using, children as activists. They want it to inspire a whole generation of up-and-coming people of that age to be on their side of the argument and think that that side of the argument is correct. Because if this kid has the courage to get up there and promote their ideas, then, you should too, your fellow teens and children. And they're trying to influence the next generation of people in these areas and convert them to this ideology. What does that leave us to do? What can we do about that? Honestly, teach your kids how to think. So what you need to do then is, when you teach them about guns and a history of gun violence, you give them facts, you give them statistics, you give them information. And I mean all of it, not just bits and pieces, not parts of it. You got to give them information on how many deaths there are a year from it, how often it happens, give them the specifics on what types of shootings happen, who committed them, where they happened. All that information is important. Then when they have all that information, don't tell them, and that's why we should ban them, or that's why we should keep them. Ask them to come up with an argument for it, aside from everything else they've heard, just the information you've given them. And ask them to think about it and come to a conclusion, and then explain that conclusion. And then counter with other questions and ask them questions. Make them think. So it's not like you're just telling them what to believe. You're teaching them how to make educated, informed decisions. And you can't take over a group of people with socialism if they're educated and informed on these issues. They're not going to choose that. So that's what I encourage, is just educating young people. Well, thank you guys again for tuning into another video, and I appreciate you watching. If you have any thoughts or comments, please leave them below. If there are any subjects you would like me to cover or issues you want to talk about, just leave a comment and we'll address it in a later on video. And make sure you hit subscribe, and then there's the little bell icon beside the subscribe button. Make sure you click that, because my videos might not always come out on like a consistent basis, regular schedule, depending on the news of the week and the day. And if something comes up and I need to cover it right then, if you have that notification bell clicked, you'll get the video notification on your phone and you'll be able to view it at your convenience. So once again, thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.